Welcome to On Strike, a production of Workers Strike Back. I'm Shama Sawant. My co-hosts Kaylin Nicholson and Emily MacArthur will be back next week. Working people around the country continue to discuss the train wreck of the Biden-Trump presidential debate and Biden's catastrophic performance, and what all this says about the Democratic Party after what can only be described as the most undemocratic Democratic primary in US history, which is obviously saying a lot.
It's no longer the conversation, I guess, for like lesser of two evils for me. It's more of like both of these candidates don't feel like viable options.
Watching the debate yesterday, you have one that lies and you had one that could barely even bring a whole coherent sentence together. And I think that we're in a really bad place when it comes to our presidential options.
The Democratic Party has said that Trump represents an existential threat to American democracy. Yet at the same time they say this, it appears the Democratic leadership remains determined to ram Biden down the throats of working people despite the absolute disaster of not only that debate, but Biden's candidacy as a whole. So in the face of that existential threat, they are prepared to risk everything rather than replace their doomed candidate. It's also remarkable that the Democratic establishment is trying to pretend nothing much has happened. It's a weapons grade level of political gaslighting that is astounding even for them.
And they have, frankly, gaslit a lot of us that he's not as old as, or he's not in as much cognitive decline as we're seeing. Frankly, I think they've been lying to us.
The dangers of Trumpism, and right-wing populism are certainly deadly serious. Coming as no surprise, the reactionary US Supreme Court has just ruled that Trump is partly shielded from prosecution as he tries to fend off an indictment in relation to the January 6, 2021 riots at the Capitol. As reported in the New York Times, the decision means that a trial in the January 6th case will almost certainly be pushed back until after the November election, and if Trump was to win the election, the Justice Department is almost certain to drop the case. All this is a stark reminder of what's most needed: an independent left working class political party rooted in mass movements that can provide an alternative to both the undemocratic party and to Trump and the right-wing Republican Party. Talking about building the left, I wanted to remind everyone to go to workerstrikeback.org and register for our inaugural national Zoom conference on July 21st. We will be joined by left independent anti-war presidential candidate Jill Stein. And if you haven't already, check out our last episode when we interviewed Jill Stein right after the Biden-Trump debate. The wreckage of the Democratic Party underscores their complete failure to address the day-to-day disaster working people have been forced to deal with: a historic cost of living crisis, deeply unaffordable rents, inflation that has pushed the cost of basic necessities through the roof, and a climate catastrophe. Before we continue, I want to remind you to like this video and subscribe to our channel. If you have been watching On Strike, you know that we bring interviews, political analysis, and strategy for the working class of the kind you simply won't find in the mainstream media. Become a member of Workers Strike Back to help ensure we can continue to organize to rebuild a fighting labor movement, and that On Strike can continue to bring the working class perspective we so badly need. We don't run any ads, we don't accept any corporate money, and we rely entirely on donations from working people. Go to workerstrikeback.org and click on Become a Member. Just before the presidential debate disaster, the so-called squad has had its own catastrophe to deal with Congressmember Jamaal Bowman's landslide defeat and Congressmember Cori Bush locked in a dead heat against her conservative Democratic opponent in the upcoming primary election in August. Today, we have a special guest to talk about all this, Briahna Joy Gray. Most of our viewers will know Briahna as the host of the Bad Faith podcast, as the former host of The Hill Rising, and the national press secretary for the 2020 presidential campaign of Bernie Sanders. Welcome, Briahna.
Thank you so much for having me, Shama. It's a real pleasure.
Likewise, we're really excited to have you on the show for the first time. Obviously, the main thing everyone is talking about is the Biden meltdown in the presidential debate. But before we get into that, I wanted to talk a little bit about what Jill Stein correctly called the elephant in the room. The fact that for working class people, there was nothing in that so-called debate for them. Even a serious pretense of representing their interests was nowhere to be seen. There was no discussion, unsurprisingly, of Medicare for all or canceling student debt or how the war on Gaza could be ended. or even just about the crisis working people are facing in general, like of unaffordable housing, the pending recession. There was just nothing for working people in that debate. Would you agree?
I entirely would agree. And the answers on to the extent that some of those top topics did come up, Gaza, for instance, you had Joe Biden lying and saying that the impediment to a ceasefire deal was in fact Hamas and not Netanyahu and his government, which has repeatedly said that they will not stop litigating the war. That's a too soft a way to put it. They will not stop the siege and genocide on Gaza until they eliminate Hamas, a goal that military experts across the kind of ideological span has said is an impossible goal. You had Donald Trump, of all people, oddly fact-checking him and saying, no, that's not the case, but also using Palestinian as a sort of slur and saying you're acting like a Palestinian. God forbid anyone in the world have some sympathy or identity of interest with the people that is undergoing what the ICJ has described as a plausible genocide. And that represents the two poles of debate on that issue in the United States. And that's one of the issues, to your point, Shama, that even came up in the first place. I don't think words like poor or working class came up at all. There was some reference to inflation, but neither candidate is able to articulate a plan of how to address the cost of living crisis. They simply blame each other for high inflation rates. And the public is supposed to, I guess, based on some kind of sense of vibes, decide which candidate is more likely to ease their strain when neither is presenting any concrete plan to do so or any real, frankly, analysis of why it is that cost of living increases have been happening at such a clip when wages have not similarly been rising.
Yeah, exactly. And to your point, they have the Democratic establishment and the Biden campaign have tried so hard to sell this Bidenomics mythology, and they're like, oh, working people just don't get it. Their lives are better, and Bidenomics is working, as if working people are just stupid and they don't understand that they have actually good lives. And I also agree with you that it was absolutely odious for both Trump and Biden to talk about the genocidal war on Gaza in the way that they did, and especially for Trump to use Palestinian as a slur and not, just complete dishonesty about where this war, the support for this war is coming from, the role of US imperialism and his own role as the warmonger in chief. And as far as the debate is concerned, it really is an unprecedented situation for the Democratic Party, the worst debate performance by an incumbent president, or really probably any major candidate, party candidate in US history. And with the whole range of voices, including the New York Times calling for Biden to step down, demanding really that he get out of the way. And all of this happening in less than 2 months before the Democratic National Convention. What are your thoughts on all of this? What do you make of all of this? And where do you think it's going?
Yeah, I mean, so one of the most kind of dispiriting but like disorienting experiences of my life was watching that debate and then watching the post-debate coverage and actually having the pundit class for once honestly assess this as the worst debate performance that we've ever seen since the advent of any kind of recording device that could prove how bad this thing was. And I say that because there has been evidence of Joe Biden's decline for years. I, as someone who worked on Bernie's 2020 campaign, remember being deeply frustrated by how the media ran cover for him even back then. Recall that during one of the major debates before a lot of the field got cleared off the debate stage, Julian Castro and Cory Booker both, Castro on stage, Booker after in the spin room, raised the question of Biden's mental competence because he seemed to lose his train of thought and trail off several times in the course of that debate. Castro famously on stage said, I don't think you remember what you were just saying. Afterward, Booker, like very gently and politely and graciously said, I think we have to consider whether Joe Biden's age is a concern. And they were met with such vicious backlash from the Democratic Party that those two men who at one time were rising stars and were looked to as potential future presidential candidates and really kind of the great, demographically diverse hope of the Democratic Party were shut out of politics. I mean, have you heard hide or hair from them since then? I think the answer is no. And so there were many instances. Matt Orfala, who is a video editor, did a supercut I was watching this morning that was over 20 minutes long, of Joe Biden telling odd, meandering stories, dog-faced pony soldier, the black kids at the pool wanted to pet my blonde leg hair, challenging voters to a push-up contest, shouting in their faces and pointing his finger, his eyes starting to bleed during a town hall back in 2019. And so this has really exposed not just Joe Biden, but the extent to which our media infrastructure manufactures consent for candidates that do not actually have broad support among the voter base. And I would also remind listeners, although I'm sure they don't need any reminding, that 2 years ago during 2022, polls reflected that 75% of the Democratic voting base, Democratic voters, 75% of them did not want Joe Biden to be the candidate. And it was because of a combination of concerns about his age and I think substantive concerns about how he has led the country. And that was prior to the disaster that is the war in Gaza, the siege on Gaza, the genocide in Gaza. So yes, it has been a betrayal on a lot of fronts. But on the flip side of that, his performance being so bad that the media class isn't trying to spin it, or now they're coming back and trying to spin it a little bit. But either his performance was so bad that there's no denying it, and there are machinations afoot to actually try to move him out, or there was a kind of a release valve from above. They got permission to criticize him in a way that they haven't gotten permission to criticize him on this age issue before. Either way, an opportunity is opening up for a different kind of conversation about whether or not democracy should finally enter this process, a process in which also we were denied an opportunity for a real primary. And what does it mean now for parties that have historically recognized that this is how things work, recognize the media blackout, recognize the way that these candidates are basically picked by the party apparatus, to make that clear to the broader public who might not have seen it because they are not leftists, they're not really plugged into what these machinations have been like. Now that it's been exposed, are there now opportunities to reach those voters and let them know that they do have some democratic options on the table that actually do speak to their broader interests, including their economic interests, including their foreign policy concerns in Gaza and Ukraine and all of the rest?
Yes, exactly. I think as you were saying, and as I was saying earlier, that this has just been months and months of gaslighting by the Democratic establishment, where it was so obvious by Biden's cognitive decline, and they kept saying, "No, he's sharp." I saw a montage somewhere, maybe on the Jon Stewart show, where they had just repeated clips of various media personalities, including Joe Scarborough, talking about how he's sharp, he's,
Sharp as a tack.
Sharp as a tack. Yeah,
Yeah.
actually you're right. It was. Yeah, they kept using sharp as a tack.
This is a man who is sharp, who is on top of his game, who knows what's going on.
He's smart. He's on his game.
His mental acuity is great.
This is a very sharp president.
And the people that I've talked to say he's as sharp as a tack. He's fine.
And then there were people saying just ridiculous things like, "Oh my God, I've been in meetings with him and I can't keep up with his brain."
And now people, by the way, are coming out and revealing the truth. So I was listening to Pod Save America, and they were saying that they were at a fundraiser, I think in California, just a couple of weeks ago, and he was bad. Basically, they said he was as bad as he was on the stage that night, but they kind of papered over it saying, well, we had attributed it to the fact that he had just gotten back from the G7 and he was in Europe and he had been traveling and we were hoping he'd have a better performance. But that's all revisionist history. These are the exact same people who are telling us that the Fox News videos of him wandering off to the side at the G7 or the World War II commemoration events were deceptively edited tapes. Don't believe your lying eyes. I mean, it's right out of 1984. And those same pundits, in I think a scramble to maintain their own legitimacy, are now trying to leak, well, yeah, I had these concerns earlier because I saw X, Y, and Z. But know that none of them were willing to come forward when it would have mattered, not just 2 weeks ago, but 2 years ago or 4 years ago.
Right. And as far as what's going to happen, in terms of what your thoughts are about what's going to happen, obviously the Democratic Party is in between a rock and a hard place. If Biden continues, obviously that is a disastrous situation for them after this performance and debate. And as you said, I think a big reason why the media, including the New York Times, said it so openly is because his performance was so bad that their own credibility was on the line if they tried to spin it as, oh, don't worry, nothing to see here, it's all fine. So I think part of the reason was that they had to do that to just maintain some shred of credibility for the establishment and their media mouthpieces. But then on the other hand, if Biden is forced to withdraw and somebody else is put in his place, what are then the prospects of the Democratic Party there? And also, I think it's also important to make the point that no matter whom they replace Biden with, it's still going to be a pro-genocidal war and anti-working class agenda because it's the Democratic Party's agenda. But talking about if Biden is forced to withdraw, then who could replace him? Obviously you've seen this, Donna Brazile, a major Democratic Party operative, saying, "How the F are you going to put all these white people ahead of Kamala?" She's referring to, of course, the fact that if Biden is going to be replaced, then it has to be Kamala Harris. What do you think is going to happen there?
It's so funny. I've had a version of this debate with my former co-host on the Hill for like years now. I have always been, I'm not going to say like I predicted this exact scenario, but I have always been very open to the idea that Biden might not be the candidate. I wouldn't say I thought it was more likely than not, but I always thought it was a real possibility that he didn't end up making it to Election Day. And, Robbie felt very differently about this. And one of the reasons that Robbie raised that he, why he didn't think it was likely to happen was the Kamala question. I never understood that, I got to be honest. Kamala has never had a natural constituency behind her. She famously had to drop out of the 2020 race prior to California because Andrew Yang, who was a relative unknown, was beating her in the polls in her own state where she was a senator. She has relied on very vocal online support from the K-Hive, which seems to behave in a way pattern-wise that suggests that it is an overlap with the Hillary Clinton Brock bot army, which is to say astroturfed and not real. And I recall the experience of being a reporter for The Intercept back in 2018, a politics editor there, and looking at the field and how things were going to emerge and people talking about Kamala as the next best thing, the next Obama, and reading the comments under any video or social media post about her being filled with people from California, largely Black people from California, that were very familiar with her criminal justice record and were very, very critical of her. So to the extent that there is a Kamala problem, how do you get rid of Kamala Harris without, provoking the base and irritating base voters? I just don't think that base exists off the internet in any meaningful way. And to the extent that there are Black voters who would be insulted by the idea that she were passed over, those are people who have already demonstrated their willingness to vote for the Democratic candidate no matter what. That's the core of the vote blue no matter who cohort. So they can be mad, but they're still going to vote for Democrats. So why should Democrats care, especially that they're going to be mad? If they're going to do this, I do think the priority should be for them. Like if I'm going to put myself in their shoes for a second, to get someone who is most likely to win. And I don't think that is Kamala Harris. Although I will say, as negative as I have been about her since she first emerged on the scene, Biden's performance was so bad that I do think it's a little bit rich for people to be talking about how bad Kamala would be as a candidate. If only because, you were about to run this guy. You're about to run the guy who can't get through a speech. And I was watching Kamala Harris, come on and do cleanup duty after the debate. And I was nervous for her. I said, oh, Lord, I think I tweeted out, do not go. Her famous borderline, do not go, Kamala. This is a setup. There's no way this is going to end well for you to have to make excuses for what we all just saw. But she actually handled herself pretty competently, including under some good questioning from Anderson Cooper, some hard questioning from Anderson Cooper. So I will say, would I pick her out of a lineup as the number one most effective candidate to win this for Democrats if that were the position I was in or the priorities that I had? No. But she would still be an enormous upgrade, it seems to me, from Joe Biden, just given how much of a decline we all witnessed on Thursday night.
I know, and everything you're saying points to the abysmal situation that's facing working people, where you have, on the one hand, you have Trump, this guy, and the growth of dangerous right-wing populism, and then you have the Democratic Party, where a really substandard candidate like Kamala Harris could then actually appear so much better because in comparison to the Biden phenomenon. And obviously, there's a lot to be said about that. But moving aside from the debate and the presidential election for a moment, the Biden debacle has not surprisingly overshadowed the Jamaal Bowman defeat in the media. But for the left, as I'm sure you'll agree, that was a very significant development. What are your thoughts on why Jamaal Bowman lost, and also, what do you think is happening or about to happen with the Cody Bush primary, and what all this says about the squad and everything?
Yeah, I mean, so principally, I think you cannot have an analysis of what happened to Jamaal Bowman without focusing on the redistricting that happened in his district, that had the effect of replacing the blacker and browner kind of Bronx, and a substantial part of his district is Mount Vernon, which is the lowest part of Westchester, immediately above the Bronx, which has similar kind of demographic characteristics in terms of socioeconomics and race as the Bronx, to replace a lot of his district with whiter, wealthier parts of Westchester. That is really the story, but also had to do with obviously an unprecedented amount of money being spent by his AIPAC-backed candidate in the district, really demonstrating the extent to which money talks, not just on the back end, but on the front end, right? The choice to redistrict his district in the way that it was part of a broader scheme to weaken the power of progressives in Congress. So to me, the takeaway here, and what I hope Jamaal Bowman and other squad members are doing some introspection on, is to what extent can you effectively exist as a member of a party that would go to such lengths to make sure that you don't have a shot of ever maintaining your seat. Again, going back to my Intercept days back in 2018, when I was hired basically to cover the midterms. I was hired about, I think, a month before AOC won her primary. And I did a lot of coverage on how they won, what the public response was, and how the Democratic Party started to mobilize to try to disincentivize any more progressives to challenge incumbents like Joseph Crowley, who was the kind of kingmaker of Queens, who AOC had unseated. And one of the things they did was to say, well, if you're a vendor who works for any of these progressive incumbents, if you provide stages for their rallies, if you provide, food and catering, you will be blacklisted for ever working for a Democratic Party ever again in your life. They were furious. They set all these rules about what it meant to challenge incumbents, and they came up with the excuse that they were never going to back a challenger over the incumbent. Well, cut to today, where you had a number of leaders of the Democratic Party, including people like Hillary Clinton, or former leaders, maybe I should say, but Hillary Clinton and Andrew Cuomo coming out to endorse Jamaal Bowman's opponent. And none of the rulemaking that had existed before about how people who challenged incumbents were going to be punished apply when the incumbent is a progressive who's a sort of a bête noire of the Democratic Party. So why then? How many more examples do we need after Bernie's 2 runs, after the challenges that have come from Democrats from within the party with the blessing of leaders of the Democratic Party, radio silence from people like Hakeem Jeffries, a Black representative from New York who has talked about identity politics and how important all of those things are, watching Jamaal Bowman get beat by a white male AIPAC-backed candidate and have absolutely nothing to say about it. It reveals the failure of identity politics. It weaponized in the way the Democratic Party does. It reveals the failures of party politics and Democratic Party politics at all from the perspective of progressives. And I would think this would be a big wake-up call for them to say, you cannot exist within the Democratic Party. Do not let your name and your voice be used to gild the lily of the Democratic Party and make it have the appearance of being a big tent that progressive voters should feel comfortable in. Instead, take a hard break and realign yourself and let the Democrats stand on their own for what they are, which is a completely bought, corporatized, AIPAC bought, Israel lobby bought party that will over and over again prioritize the interests of the military industrial complex, foreign countries, the deep state over the interests of some of the poorest people in America who live in Jamaal Bowman's district, who live in Richie Torres's district. Richie Torres, another man of color, who kind of uses his identity to launder himself as a progressive in New York, has the highest child poverty rate of any district in the United States of America. It's not in Mississippi. It's not in West Virginia. It's in New York. And this is someone who has spent, if you look at his Twitter feed, his entire kind of public persona is about cheerleading for the genocide in Gaza. It's disgusting. And this is an opportunity for people like Jamaal Bowman to be saying, look at who the Democratic Party really is. And unfortunately, I think what we're seeing is people like AOC doing new ads, going to pep rallies, all in the interest of backing up Joe Biden, instead of doing what they promised to be, which was, quote, I'd rather be a one-term congressperson than continue to launder the failures of the Democratic Party into the future.
Well said, Briahna, about what the real story here being a part of the real story, in my view, as you were saying, is that the Democratic Party itself is in question here. What happened in the Jamaal Bowman primary is such an indictment of the nature of the Democratic Party itself. I mean, sometimes people can forget that there was a Democratic Party primary. It was not a Democrat versus a Republican where the AIPAC was putting in millions of dollars to fund the Republican candidate and ensure their victory. It was actually a Democratic primary. And it is just a searing statement about the Democratic Party itself, and at this moment, especially being the party that is allowing the genocidal war to go on. It also, in my view, is a statement on the squad themselves, though, and I wanted to hear what you thought about it in the sense that, you remember when AOC, I think it was a couple of years ago, when she said that, everybody on the left was saying, not everybody, but many on the left, and you and I certainly were part of that, were saying that I should have used the sort of the force the vote moment to use the numerical strength that the squad had to, at the very least, extract something from the Democratic establishment when Nancy Pelosi was up for a vote. And her explanation of why they didn't do that, and remember, she was asked this question after the MAGA Republicans used the exact same strategy to force their agenda, which obviously is, in our view, is a really harmful and dangerous right-wing agenda. But the point is that they had the courage to use it. And in response to people, ordinary people, it wasn't the established left, but ordinary people were asking her on social media, you told us this couldn't be done, but they did it. Why didn't you do it? And part of her response, and I think that this was the pivotal part of her response, and it was a rare, honest moment these days from AOC, where she said that if you did that, from inside the Democratic Party, it would cause what she said was quote unquote relational harm, and what she meant was relational harm with the powers that be in the Democratic Party. But the Jamaal Bowman defeat shows that the party establishment, let alone the more right-wing forces, they are not interested in somebody who is inconsistently on their side. They want die-hard advocates for their side, which is why they poured all this money into Latimer's race to defeat Bowman. But on the other hand, if you yourself, claiming to be a representative of ordinary people, working people, if you don't consistently fight for, not just stand for in rhetoric, but fight for working people, then you're going to lose the support that working people can provide for you, and you're going to sort of be in the middle where you're really not having any kind of base. And I think what's happened with us in the last 10 years in the city council races in Seattle is also a really good example for that. As you remember, Briahna, I faced an attempted recall in 2021, and it was seemingly insurmountable. They pulled out all the stops against us. The Supreme Court of Washington State, gave the timing of their ruling for the recall to go ahead was such that ultimately the election ended up happening in the middle of winter in December, in the most inhospitable situation. It was, it's a rainy and cold, dreary winter in Seattle. To get the vote out to prevent the recall took everything from us. But the reason we were able to accomplish that was that in the whole 10 years, we never wavered from where we stood, which was with working people. And we had a whole track record of having won victories for working people. What do you think this says about the squad? I mean, I agree with you about what you're saying, but at the same time, it's based on the assumption that Jamaal Bowman or AOC, they want to do something different. But at this point, do you still think that their intentions are good, but they just are misled? That's one question. And also the other point is, does it even matter at this point, even if their intentions are good? This strategy is not working. So why should working people bother with this? Don't we need a new party? And don't we need to break from the Democrats themselves?
So yes, we need a new party. The question about Jamaal Bowman and kind of his motives, I do think that it is absolutely true that part of why, I'm not saying it would have made the difference given the enormous amount of money that was put into his race and the enormous challenge of what redistricting means. That I'm not saying that this would have enabled him to win, but I do think part of the irony here is that the perception of him not having fulfilled his promises to his community, the perception of him having bent the knee to corporate Democrats and not been a strident and unapologetic voice for his constituents and for the left, the way that they all represented themselves as being as they were running, impacted his ability to raise the people power out of his district that would have been necessary to mount a really strong challenge to Latimer. This happens again and again where the left electeds tend to bite the hand that feeds them, bite the hand that put them in the office in the first place, turn their back on them the second they get in office. And then when the bedfellow that they've chosen, the Democratic Party, then turns their back on them and betrays them and tries to kick them out and tries to kill them, they will come running back to us saying, then why don't we have your support? And even, I didn't want Jamaal Bowman to lose, but there is this sort of sense of, well, how can I rally to your defense at this point? You've never submitted yourself to independent media. There was a moment a couple of years ago where someone from Jamaal Bowman's team had reached out for him to come on bad faith and for us to have a conversation sort of post force the vote. And he rescheduled at the last minute and the rescheduling never happened. We don't have those kinds of relationships the way that right-wing media has a relationship with the kind of, I don't know what you want to call them, outsider, far right, whatever, the Marjorie Taylor Greene anti-establishment right crowd on their side, so that they can get support from their base, they can get out there, they can have, platforms outside of the corporate Republican media. They support themselves. They have a kind of an internal support structure in their own media. We don't have any of that because there is this distrust that has existed that is based in the fact that we are going to ask them hard questions to the extent that they betray their underlying values. So I do think that was a problem with Jamaal Bowman for sure. And broadly, do I think that he is sort of like a good faith actor? I don't know. And I don't know that it really matters. What I do know is what is exposed about the Democratic Party, which is that someone who wasn't exactly, so strident. I mean, I want to give him credit where credit's due in terms of his advocacy for humanitarian issues in Palestine. But it wasn't as though he wasn't taking the votes that he needed to take, that they weren't still doing rotating villain, that, AOC will take the hard Iron Dome vote this time and you take the hard Iron Dome vote last time. They were still doing what needed to be done for the Democratic Party to advance its policy agenda in the region. And him just saying some words about maybe we should have a ceasefire and maybe it's bad to kill 14,000 kids and maybe you shouldn't be giving the leader of a far right genocidal government a bear hug and invite him to really basic things like that gets you ousted by your own party. So, this is what to me, the real takeaway is not is he a true believer or not, or how, where does his heart lie? But even if his heart only lies a little tiny bit, or, at a kind of a normie amount in sympathies with what's going on in Palestine and what's going on in Gaza, that is enough to get you kicked out of the Democratic Party. So why would anybody invest in a Democratic Party who looks at the fact that polls showed overwhelming majority of its base wants a ceasefire, but will punish an elected official within their own party who says as much?
Exactly. That I agree with you that this is ultimately this is a statement against the Democratic Party. And why would anybody with any good intentions to do the right thing is maybe it's against the war, but also for working people, why would you choose to run from inside the Democratic Party? And I think it also brings up some other points. The other points are also related to sort of the electoral and careerist focus. I mean, I'm in total agreement with you that it's not so much what's on their minds, because we're not mind readers, so we don't know what Jamaal Bowman or AOC's actual intentions are. But if you look at the political approach that they have used, which is no different than any other run-of-the-mill politician, which is that it's two things. One is it's very careerist, in the sense that their main focus is how they are going to continue their political march up the ranks in the Democratic Party, and all the things that you talked about. So the round-robin villain strategy that they use is part of that. But it's also and this is, I think, this is also very important for the left, in the sense that we cannot really build anything on the basis of individuals, however well-meaning they might be. Let's assume they're well-meaning. If their primary focus is building their career, because that is step number one for selling out, and that's true, I will say, Briahna, also here, and for our viewers, that question is not simply if you're inside the Democratic Party. That question will confront you even if you run as an independent, if you win as an independent. There are enormous and endless pressures on you to sell out. And so if your career is one of the considerations, then it is almost inevitable that you're going to end up selling out with the best of intentions. And then the other thing here, which I wanted to bring in, is the electoral focus, and not understanding or not accepting that your campaign or your elected office, really, if we want to do something for working people, then it has to be not just about that office, but that office has to serve as a vehicle to build wider movements, which can succeed in mobilizing and activating a whole mass of people in order to actually win something, which is what you need to win anything. And to your point, if I agree with you, just in looking at the parameters that were facing Jamaal Bowman in the primary, we can't claim that if he had been true to his promises to the working class, if he had been consistently against the war on Gaza, then he would have won. Of course, we can't make that claim. But the flip side is that if you had not broken your promises, then wouldn't you have left a path forward, even if you lost, a path forward to continue building for working people, using your profile to continue building that? And I think that's where the problem lies. Like you said, like people weren't enthusiastic to stand in his corner. And also the larger point about the squad having set, in my view, an absolutely wrong example, like giving cover to Biden, AOC calling Pelosi Mama Bear. All of this was highly damaging and disorienting. And in fact, it has helped open up the space for Trump and the right wing. What do you think?
I think that's absolutely true. I want to go to your point also about the kind of the professional sacrifices, all of the pressures there are to bend the knee and conform. I recently on my own show had a conversation with Kim Iverson, who was a very popular show, and she also used to be a co-host on The Hill with me before she was fired or she chose to leave because of some internal censorship. They did not allow her to do an interview with Dr. Fauci that I think the audience really would have liked and that she would have wanted to do, because they were sort of protecting, as they did with me also, I would argue, a guest over their own host, because upper management didn't like the brand of politics that was coming out of the show. And was trying to censor it. But we were talking about this issue. She supports Jill Stein. She says she's going to vote for Jill Stein. But we were talking about RFK Jr. and the argument that some are making that he is a better vessel to break the duopoly, quote unquote, because he's polling better and he will basically hurt Democrats and Republicans more electorally in this round. And I raised a number of the points that you just alluded to in that conversation, that RFK Jr. is not running with a party. I think he has established a party to get on the ballot in a couple of states, but he has not established a party for the purposes of longevity beyond his own run and to have a broader effect outside of his own personal getting into the White House, unlike the Green Party, that his political position on Gaza and the choice of having to surround himself with people like Rabbi Shmuley really indicates a failure, an analytical failure, and what it means to break the duopoly and really stick it to the deep state and to what the blob's foreign policy agenda really is. The inconsistency between his position in Ukraine and in Israel cannot be explained by any kind of cogent belief system. It does really seem to be based on his own personal belief biases. And frankly, given the way that he's talked about Palestinians, I would say prejudices. So all that being said, I do think that is part of why I find myself really gravitating toward the Green Party and to movement efforts like Worker Strike Back that seem to really try to not focus disproportionately so on the human being, on the kind of figurehead or avatar that is leading a movement, and really understands that you have to have some kind of mechanism to maintain pressure. And also you have to have a theory of the case. Having a theory of the case makes it so that when you look at somebody's broader policy platform, it all makes sense, it all hangs together. And you're not spending so much time trying to excuse away why someone is behaving quote unquote irrationally on one issue. It's not that they're behaving irrationally on one issue. It's that they're behaving in a scattershot manner across the board. And just because you happen to agree with them here or there, that's not the kind of ideological consistency that is going to have the effect of doing the very difficult work of disentangling the duopoly. It's not just a word. It's not just a kind of a vibe that we bring up in podcasts to make it sound good. Like, do you understand the relationship between our government and international monetary actors like the IMF and the World Bank, and the role that they play in suppressing the global South's economic development, how placing them in those kind of debt burdens and then using our threat of our military or covert CIA actions to overturn governments when they don't comply, when they won't take these loans that keep them in debt servitude, is how we manage to puppeteer the entire geopolitical economic stage. Like, that's the kind of analysis that I need people to see. And someone who would back Israel the way that RFK does, as a kind of a military outpost in the Middle East that is purely our ally, not because of some deep-seated love and affection that these like American Christian Zionists have for the Jewish people. To me, it's dispiriting, it's disappointing, it's frustrating, because it's people who seem to know better, to seem to understand the ultimate goal, but because of a desire to like win or to back someone who has good polling or something like that, they are willing to go that way. So I've gone a little bit off track, but I do want to say that I really do think it is important for people to be reminded of the value of working within whether it's a party infrastructure or an organizational infrastructure that has both an ideological basis for the work that it does and like tangible infrastructure that has longevity, that can push this goal beyond the kind of fleeting electoral attempts of one given candidate.
I could not agree more. I'm so glad you brought this up, actually, Briahna, about RFK Jr., because I was watching part of the show you did with Kim Iverson, and I think, however well-meaning, this idea of trying to find a pragmatic shortcut to break the duopoly, so to say, can be very dangerous, because like you were alluding to, RFK Jr. really, I mean, he's a Democratic Party insider. He's a blue-blooded Kennedy family member. He has, as you so eloquently said, been a staunch and full-throated advocate of the Israeli regime, and he has publicly opposed calls for ceasefire. And I really appreciated you making that point, which is the really important point, which is that it's not that somebody like RFK accidentally has a bad position on one issue. No, that position he has on the genocidal war on Gaza is flowing from his overall politics. And I think tied to that, it's really important for people to be clear that he's not a fighter for the interests of working class people. I mean, he makes certain pretensions, he has certain rhetoric, populist rhetoric that suggests that he might be, but it is no different in that sense than Trump, who said, I'm the guy for the forgotten men and women. And let's not forget that, and this is obviously before the time of a lot of young people, but the billionaire Ross Perot got over 18% of the vote in the presidential election in 1992, and he did not break the duopoly any more than RFK would for whatever vote he's going to get. And I think we need clear and consistent working class politics, which is why I believe we should support Stein. I mean, looking at it strategically, if Jill Stein, with her working class anti-war campaign, can win 5 to 6% of the vote, that actually would get noticed by millions of working and young people. It has the potential. It's not an automatic, but it has the potential to be a powerful impetus for the left. It can be an opening. I mean, worker strike back certainly, and I personally would be interested in building on that, maybe calling for an organizing conference early next year if that were to happen. Obviously, none of this is a given. I mean, how much Jill Stein is going to win is not a given. It's a question of how much the left mobilizes around her campaign. And all of this could really raise the potential for concretely building the new party, not abstractly talking about it, which a lot of people are doing, but it's a question of strategy. So on that note, are you supporting Jill Stein's campaign?
I mean, I am. It was a tough choice this year. I think a lot of us were really excited about the idea of Cornel West leaving NPP and joining the Green Party. It seemed like all of the kind of people that were throwing their hat in the ring and the parties that were in the mix and the kind of ideological framework that we believe in were all coalesced into one place. And I think when Dr. West then chose to leave the Green Party and go it alone as an independent, a lot of folks were frustrated and were struggling to figure out how to reconcile their deep respect for Dr. West and his campaign with their deep respect for Dr. Jill Stein and the infrastructure of the Green Party, which feels like something really concrete to pour into. And I had both on my show several times to talk to Dr. West about why he chose to leave. And he made some pretty sharp criticisms of Jill Stein and the Greens. I had Dr. Stein back on to rebut, and I found that she comported herself really well and seemed to be very clear and very mature and very responsible in the way she described both the kind of relationship with Dr. West and what the goals of the Green Party campaign were. And so it seems to me quite clear, both because of how they comported themselves in the context of their of Dr. West's departure from the Green Party, and I think more importantly, what Jill Stein has been able to do in terms of ballot access over Dr. West, precisely because of the support of the Green Party. She is going to be the progressive candidate that is on the most ballots, who is already at 270 electoral votes worth of ballot access. It's just a no-brainer. And this is why it was so frustrating for Dr. West to have left the Greens, is that the writing was on the wall, it seemed, as soon as he did that. He's not RFK Jr. He isn't from a millionaire family. He can't go and get a VP, or I guess he could have, but for principled reasons, isn't going to go and get a VP who happens to be a billionaire who can fund your multi-million-dollar Super Bowl commercials and pay for you to have a fake debate set up. It looked great. I do wish that we could do things like that, like what RFK Jr. did. But this is part of why it's frustrating to hear people say, well, he's so much more popular. It must be mean because he's a populist. No, he went out and got the ex-wife of the Google billionaire, who was a billionaire herself, to join his campaign so that he could fund his own popularity and buy his way a certain degree into these electoral results. Is it populist to throw billionaire money at kind of media events and spectacle, and to trade on your name as a core member of the Democratic Party? Is that what populism is? To be a McKinney Democrat and rely on the name recognition for people whose politics do not accord with those who are now coming along and following you? So that's a long-winded way to say yes. It is very clear to me that Jill Stein is the best by a mile in terms of both substance and pragmatism for left-leaning, populist, independent voters in the 2024 election.
Thank you very much for sharing that with us, Briahna. I really appreciate that, and I really agree with you. Before we let you go, I just want to ask you one last question. As you know, Worker Strike Back and, of course, On Strike, our show here, have been calling for building the biggest possible protests at the Democratic National Convention And it won't be any surprise to you that we are doing a rally there where Jill Stein will be joining us. Will you be able to, are you first of all going to be there at the DNC protest? And if so, would you be willing to speak at our rally?
I hadn't planned to go, but it's an interesting thought. I'd definitely be open to it, so we should talk about that.
Let's do that. I'd really love to have you there. And thank you so much, Briahna. This has, as always, when I talk to you, it has been both enlightening and really energizing. And I feel really great after talking to you. Thank you so much for coming on our show.
Thank you. The feeling is mutual. Take care. I'll hope to talk to you again soon.
If you enjoyed this conversation and want to find out more about building for the biggest possible protest at the Democratic National Convention, then go to workerstrikeback.org and register for our inaugural national Zoom conference on July 21st, where we'll be talking to Jill Stein and building for the DNC. If you watched On Strike before, you'll know that we provide an analysis from the point of view of working class people about the problems we face in our daily lives under capitalism. In every episode, On Strike also presents a strategy for working class movements to fight back. On Strike talks about why it's crucial that every fight for change emphasizes the need to build working class solidarity and is linked with organizing a powerful challenge to the political establishment and the capitalist system itself. This is something you won't find on mainstream media. That's why we need your support for On Strike. Go to workerstrikeback.org and click on Become a Member. Solidarity.